Hello and welcome to ILTV's Elections Arena. I'm Aaron Porras, and today in the ring, Prime Minister Netanyahu has officially been indicted, and the Palestinians are planning a day of rage. But first, to introduce today's guests, we have attorney and legal advisor to the Israel Movement for Governability and Democracy, or Meshilut, Simcha Rotman, and the founder of the Front for the Protection of Democracy, Uri Zaki. Thank you both so much for coming in today. Let's get right to it. Now, Israeli Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit has officially now indicted Prime Minister Netanyahu in 3 different cases for 3 counts each of fraud and breach of trust and 1 count of bribery. And as you might expect, the results in Israel have been crazy. For one, Netanyahu will continue in his post for as long as possible as he denies the allegations and is not required to step down. But Likud party primaries are now on the horizon as Netanyahu rivals look to replace him, and a 3rd election cycle is quickly becoming a reality. So, my first question, gentlemen, is Netanyahu is expected to resign from his 4 other ministerial positions. Do you think that he'll actually follow through with that, and who will replace him?
Look, I think the replacement question is not that important. He has to resign according to the Supreme Court's judgment in what we call the Deri and Pinchasi case back in the 90s when those 2 were indicted as ministers. The Supreme Court ruled that they have to step down from their ministerial positions. Netanyahu, at least so far, does not seem as going to apply to the to this ruling of the Supreme Court. I'm not sure why. The Attorney General assumed that he will comply with it. So far, he hasn't resigned. We're a few days after the indictment. I don't know.
First, there is no indictment yet. Indictment has to go through the Knesset committee, and then the discussion about immunity. So indictment did not happen yet.
So what did happen? Because everybody's saying, okay,
it's announcing. It's really a good question because the so-called quote unquote indictment paper that Mandelblit presented is not following any rule regarding indictments. He doesn't have the list of witnesses. Many problems with this document. It looks more like a PR piece than an indictment papers, and that's a problem. That's a legal problem for the Attorney General. It's a legal problem for the State of Israel. But put that aside. Even after indictment, even after formal indictment. And in Deri and Pinchasi cases, some of them actually asked for immunity and got immunity, and the Supreme Court just disregarded it. So let's just assume that he was indicted. Deri and Pinchasi cases were in the 90s, as Uri rightfully said. In 2001, the Knesset changed the basic law and said specifically, it's written like black and white, a minister or a prime minister that is being indicted does not have to quit. So if in Israel,
so why is it that nobody's bringing up that?
I am bringing, and I'm not the only one. First, but and there is being also Yuval Elbashan, the dean of the Ono College, wrote about it. I'm not the only one, but it doesn't really matter. It's really black and white on paper. The question is, but the sad thing that in the past following years, and I have to say Netanyahu has some blame in this issue, the Supreme Court of Israel taught the public in Israel that the basic law or a law is just a draft to put on his mind and what the judges think the law should be. So many people predict that the Supreme Court will disregard the law, and although the law says specifically how to run a trial against a minister or against a prime minister, the Supreme Court will say, okay, but we don't think it's a good situation, so we say they have to quit. I don't accept it, and that's not the law.
Uri?
First of all, it is in the Israeli system, much like the American system that most of our viewers know, the verdicts of the Supreme Court has the power of law. I mean, they are the ones who have the ability and the position to interpret the laws, and according to their interpretation, that's how the law is being interpreted. That's the same in the United States, same in Israel. We're part of the...
But then does that legal precedent supersede any sort of changes to basic law that come after that precedent?
First of all, the basic law, I don't think Simcha is he's right about prime minister. I'm not sure he's right about ministers. I will check it. In any case, we have to remember that the Netanyahu government and Netanyahu himself is not the elected prime minister of Israel. He is the transit prime minister after 2 elections in which he wasn't able.
He was an interim prime minister until there is another government.
Right, but he's an interim prime minister. That's a different story than the law is talking about. The law is specifically talks about once a prime minister in the middle of his term gets an indictment. Then what Simcha is saying is right.
But Mandelblit just formed a panel and came out and announcing that Netanyahu does not need to step down.
And
as long as he is an interim, but he hasn't answered a very critical and crucial question: whether Netanyahu, a member of Knesset Netanyahu, can get the mandate to form a new coalition. Whether he's, even suitable to do that according to the law, taking into account the Derek Pinchasi judgment.
Simcha?
Again, we are having a discussion when the law is very, very clear. If 61 members of Knesset say we want Netanyahu to be prime minister, the law is like really black and white. That's like the words. The presidents need to give him the opportunity to form a government. People now say maybe we will interpret the ideas, the general ideas of what's
that's
good.
A legal system.
What's good? That's not our legal system.
That's our legal system.
That's not our legal system.
Compare the situation to Olmert's case then. What are the differences?
Olmert was not indicted first. He quit not because he was indicted. He quit because he saw that he can't rule. He had 3% approval rate when he quit. He couldn't pass legislation in the Knesset.
Maybe he was a responsible prime minister.
When he quit, maybe.
So what about Netanyahu now, who arguably, twice has failed to form a coalition?
So what I'm saying, if Netanyahu won't be able to form a government, and the debates that we're having is meaningless. If he won't have 61 members of the Knesset to support his government, then the discussion is anyway void. But what I'm saying is the 61 Knesset of members of support is the only question. I don't accept, and I think no one in his right mind, in the US, in Israel, in anywhere else, should accept the fact that 61, the majority of Israel, will support a prime minister, will vote for him, and someone in the Justice Department or someone in the courts will say, oh, you know what? 61 votes, the majority of the public in Israel supports this prime minister, but we say he is not eligible based on our mind, based not about anything in the laws, just about our view on proper government. That's not democracy, that's not law, that's not justice, that's anarchy.
The kind of democracy that Simcha and unfortunately Netanyahu, by the way, not since he started. Simcha has been persistent in such views. Netanyahu wasn't like that until he himself was indicted or got into a legal problem. Because Netanyahu, before the indictments, before his legal problems, was for the rule of law. And and what Simcha is suggesting is something which is similar to what is Orban doing in Hungary, taking the power out of the Supreme Court. Wrecking altogether the checks and balances in our system. Yes, a prime minister is not has like supreme power over everything. It's not correct.
In which democratic country the Supreme Court tells the public who is eligible to be a prime ministster?
Including our democracy.
It's a mind blowing.
Including our democracy, age-wise, there are criteria.
Including our democracy. One, if you consider this an unelected justices telling the public who they can't vote for and who they can't vote for,
that's not a democracy. In Brazil, in many other cases.
That wasn't, but okay.
All right, well, so now let's talk a little bit about the 61 vote that you mentioned earlier, because right now we're heading towards a third election. Very likely.
Because of this, of his own legal problems.
But it's very likely.
It's
very likely
of the justice system. But okay.
Whatever the case, it's very likely right now. Most people expect third election cycle come by March. Now, in that event, the Likud is also now pushing new legislation that would change the way that vote is conducted, in which if nobody again can form a coalition, we vote directly for prime minister. What do you think of this law? Can you maybe break this down for us? This draft bill?
I did not see. I heard this as an idea. I did not see any draft law with specific details. But as a general idea, we tried it in Israel, and if you build a system of separation of powers like you have in the U.S., when the election to the president is separate and the election to separate houses of Congress is separate, and everyone can operate by themselves without the day-to-day. No one, the president does not need to have a majority in the parliament on every decision, every daily decision. And he cannot do laws that block him because he has the veto power. So if you have this kind of balance of power, that's a different game. If you do half of the work that needs to be done, and you just say, I will vote for a prime minister, and he will still need to have 61 coalition, and he will still need the Knesset on everyday decisions, then what you'll get is a very weak prime minister. We tried it in Israel and it failed miserably.
Well, from what I understand from this new draft is that in the event that a direct prime minister election is held, whoever wins that vote would get an additional 12 Knesset seats to his or her party, which would then allow for a more stable coalition.
Look, you know, in
what
we call football and what Americans call soccer, when there is a tie and it's a tournament, you have then the penalty goals that determine the score of the game. Look, I agree with Simcha that you can't do. I mean, I'm against a presidential system in Israel. I think the parliamentary system is better, especially for a society like Israel. But you can't mix it. What they tried to do in the 90s in Israel ruined the political arena in Israel. It is true that what they suggest is not something which will be constant, but rather, if I understand correctly, a specific legislation for this deadlock. I think the deadlock is not because of politics. The deadlock is because of one person. Therefore,
so why do you think he's making? Why do you think that the Likud is pushing this law then?
Look, the Likud today is something. When you talk about the Likud is Netanyahu. I mean, it's because Netanyahu wants a way out of a deadlock that he creates. If anyone else from the Likud would have been the chair of the Likud right now, and mind you, in Israel we don't elect a person. We elect a party. We elect a list. We don't have direct elections right now. That's exactly what you're talking about. So it is true that Netanyahu is the leader of the Likud, and people who voted for the Likud knew they voted for Netanyahu. But the Likud can replace its leader and its candidate for prime minister, or the Likud can even do something very small that Blue and White is asking it. Let's go for a rotation prime minister government, and you'll be second the rotation. We'll ask for the court, and Netanyahu, at least so far, says he'll accept the court ruling. Stay out of the position for 2 years. You'll be back after 2 years. Even this he's not ready to. Why? Because he wants to do whatever he can to undermine the judicial system here in Israel.
Simcha, how do you respond?
First, I agree with Uri that he didn't do anything until now to undermine the judicial system in Israel, and the judicial system in Israel needs undermining. The judicial system in Israel is basically the rule of law. No one respects it in the justice system in Israel. When you have a very specific basic law on how to form a government, and people say, "Oh, we can tell the president of Israel what to do based on some unelected official decision," when the law says specifically that the president is immune to any legal, it's the words, the president will be immune to any legal action concerning his deeds about forming a government. Like, you can't say it more in the words of the law. And people say, oh, we need Mandelblit to safeguard us from the president, from the laws, from the elected officials, from everyone. That's not a democracy.
Judiciary is a source.
Then we're moving on.
A judiciary is a source of pride of Israel in the world. We're known to have an amazing judicial system. It's so depressing hearing Simcha here, and it's more depressing that Netanyahu, who we see now behind you, who was someone as part of the tradition of Menachem Begin of the Likud, respectful of the law, now became this, has this human shield in front of him.
One sentence, if I can.
Very brief. We have to move
Our
on.
court is a source of mockery. Justice Scalia said he doesn't read any foreign rulings besides Israeli, because then he knows that the Supreme Court of the U.S. is not so bad because you have Israel. It's a source of mockery around the world.
This is what you say is so incorrect.
That's a
amazing.
Quote. That's a quote.
Oh, Justice Scalia.
Okay.
An appointee of the Republicans.
At any rate, we're going to have to move on. We'll see what happens. Of course, we have the Likud primaries coming up as well, so we'll see what happens. Now, moving on, the relative quiet along the Gaza border has been broken again as terrorists in the Strip fire a mortar shell into Israel Monday evening. And meanwhile, the IDF is now preparing for heightened tensions around Gaza as well as in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, coinciding with the Palestinians' so-called Day of Rage. In fact, the Palestinians plan to march in major cities and friction points all across the region on Tuesday in protest against the United States' recent policy changes regarding Israeli settlements.
The establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not, per se, inconsistent with international law.
Now, Simcha, from a legal position, Israel and the United States and select others say that the West Bank, Judea and Samaria is disputed territory, not occupied territory, and that the settlements are not illegal per se, as we just heard from Secretary of State Pompeo. What is your legal opinion on the status of this region?
I think that international law, it's a term, if I would quote Dershowitz, he said it's something that came out from the mind of some left-wing liberals in academia. That's Dershowitz saying. Especially when we're talking about what's called in the law terms, lex specialis. That's the only place around the world that this situation happened. We never have a mandate that's designated to be a Jewish homeland, and then parts of it were taken in this time and that time. It's a lex specialis. You cannot have a law, a general applicable law. Just put in mind who is the legislator and who are the courts. That's a different question. So international law is a term used to say international politics. That's what we have here, international politics, and it can change, as we can see in the U.S. Department of State when they.
Historically speaking, if we connect the dots, where does Israel sit today?
Historically speaking, the Judea and Samaria were part of the British mandate designated for a Jewish state. In 1947, there was a decision by the UN saying there will be two-state solution. The two-state solution of 1947 was dependent on the sides accepting it. The Jews accepted, the Arabs denied it, so we don't have the 1947 resolution. Anything that came after or before it has zero meaning from the international law point of view.
Uri?
First of all, the international law point of view is Simcha, and not even Pompeo determines what's international law. We have legal institutions that are international. We have international organizations who determine what is the international law stand on issues. We have treaties, so on and so forth. By the way, Simcha, international law got the real push after World War II, especially by Jewish jurists who wanted to prevent another Holocaust. I think, again, this is a source of pride and not something you have to see as an enemy. Well, with regard to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, whatever you want to call it, it's an occupied territory if you go there. I mean, I served there, and I controlled citizens by the might of my gun. It's occupied. It's obvious it's occupied. It's not part of the state of Israel per se. It's not. I mean, the laws of Israel, the Knesset is not the ruler of the occupied territories. It's the general of the Central Command.
So between 1948 and 1967, was Jordan occupying that space?
Of course.
What
Yes,
what do you think?
yes,
What do you think is the role of the United States in all of this then?
That's a different story. I mean, I'm not saying that what Pompeo is saying is irrelevant, because what the United States has to be, it has to lead for a permanent status agreement between us and the Palestinians, who will end the situation that is a problem for the world, and mostly so for the Zionist vision of a democratic Jewish homeland. As long as we occupy millions of people without basic rights, under the might of our gun, then that's a threat to our identity.
Why was the idea of occupation never brought up until 1967?
What do you mean?
Against Jordan. Why was the idea of an occupation in this area? Well, because you're saying that it was obvious
I don't know.
I don't know. And there was no argument against Jordan.
I don't care. I care about Israel. I don't care about having debates with Palestinians or Jordanians. This is the most eminent existential threat to the state of Israel, as long as you see it as a democratic Jewish homeland, which is how Herzl seen it, how Jabotinsky seen it, how David Ben-Gurion seen it, how Menachem Begin seen it.
Announcement? You're against the White House's recent announcement?
Of course it is, because he takes out the role that America can be as an honest broker. Once he takes all the Israeli extreme right positions, he cannot lead any agreement, and this is not something that the only superpower is supposed to do.
When you talk about occupied territory, the first question you need to ask is occupied from who? From who did we occupy these territories? There were never a state called Palestine. If we occupied it from Jordan, Jordan does not have any claim for this land. So, and we have a peace agreement with Jordan, and they don't want this land. So we occupied it from who? But the question is from no one.
It.
And the question
so
is,
annex it. Give them the right to vote.
That's another discussion, as you said. That's another discussion. But occupied, it's not. Now to the population. The population is not under Israeli sovereignty. It's a problem.
Of course it is.
But 90% of the population of Judea and Samaria are living under the autonomy of the Palestinian Authority. They don't pay taxes to Israel. They don't get the civil services from Israel, and they have the security.
Yes, it's a deluxe occupation.
The police, and everyone else are working for the Palestinian Authority, who is sadly independent of Israel. But the Palestinian Authority rules 90% of the population in Judea and Samaria, and I accept, because if you said
50% of the territory.
if you said the problem is with the population, and I think you are right, the problem is with the population. I'm sure that you will call me together on the annexation of Area C, who almost has none.
No, because I'm against a South African Bantustan under the Jewish state. I think that's crazy. That's a non-Jewish notion that only people who distorted Zionism and Jewish history can come up with.
So don't give me excuses about occupied population, because you don't care about the population. Otherwise, you would annex. Would you annex Ariel?
Would you annex Ariel? No.
Why not?
Authority.
No Palestinian lives in
Authority
in
is a municipal union, nothing more than that. It doesn't have any sovereignty under anyone.
The city of Ariel, a lot of Jews
I hope
live there. Would you annex
its
it?
residents back into proper Israel.
So you don't want the area, the population. You don't care about the population. You don't want.
Of course, I care about the population.
You don't want
totally
to
different
have Judea
story
and Samaria.
than the Golan Heights, where you don't have population. When you have 2.5 million people, it's a different story. When you control every aspect of their lives with your guns, yes, that's occupation.
So, as I said, to annexation of Area C will have we can give even citizenship to the 100,000 Palestinians who live in South Africa.
Unfortunately, we have to end it here. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this very heated debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, again, that is all the time that we have in the elections arena. I'd like to thank our guests again, Simcha Rotman and Uri Zaki, for joining us. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. Also, remember that for more news from ILTV, please follow us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next time.